The sky over the Mojave stretched out like a pale canvas smeared with wind and sunlight. Piper Hayes gripped the yoke of her Cessna 172, knuckles whitening, eyes darting between the altimeter, the artificial horizon, and the thin gray blur of the distant mountains. Civilian aircraft were always warned away from the base, the invisible blue lines etched into every sectional chart, the words restricted airspace flashing like a warning tattoo across her mind. Yet somehow she had drifted perilously close. She cursed herself quietly, heart hammering. She had planned the flight carefully, filed her route down to the last waypoint, but weather didn't negotiate. The wind had come unexpectedly, a swirl of gusts that pushed her eastward, nudging her toward the forbidden zone. She corrected with a slight bank, yet every adjustment seemed to send her further into the gray. The tower crackled sharply through her headset. 9043, you are entering restricted airspace. Turn immediately. The words were clipped professional, but in Piper's chest they ignited a flare of fear. She swallowed, forcing calm into her voice. Turning left, 9043. Her hands shook slightly on the yoke, fighting both the turbulence and the rising panic in her stomach. The plane pitched against the gusts, wings slapping like the arms of a wild animal. She could hear the engine protesting, the small hum of the Cessna carrying her body and her nerves into a space she didn't belong. Then the radar blinked. The blip marking her position on the control screens jumped abruptly, painting her as higher than she was, well above the 5,500 feet she had been maintaining for the last 10 minutes. Piper froze mid-turn. That wasn't possible. She was looking at her own instruments, staring down at the numbers glowing steadily on her dashboard. Altitude 5,500. Vertical speed 0. Yet the tower's voice came again, sharper this time, slicing through the cockpit like a blade. 9043, confirm altitude. You are above clearance. State intentions immediately. Piper's throat went dry. Above clearance. She was nowhere near the restricted upper levels, not by a long shot. She tried to speak, but her voice quavered. I'm at 5500, maintaining altitude. The controller didn't respond immediately. There was a long, tense pause that made her stomach twist. Every second felt magnified, stretched into an eternity. Somewhere in the dim haze of the Mojave, the small plane she trusted with her life felt suddenly too fragile, too insignificant. Her mind raced through every scenario she had learned at flight school, every emergency drill she had practiced countless times. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be climbing. And yet, on the radar, she was a ghost pretending to ascend, a phantom on the screen that looked like defiance. Piper banked left again, trying to correct her path, trying to make sure she was miles away from any airfield or restricted corridor. The wind slapped her cheek, rattling the small aircraft like a toy. The sunlight glinted sharply off the aluminum wing, and for a moment the beauty of the sky made her forget the fear, but only for a heartbeat. The frequency crackled again, and she remembered why she was scared. Maintain current heading. Do not deviate. Unidentified behavior detected. Unidentified. The word tasted of danger, of immediate threat. Piper forced herself to breathe. She had seen this in movies, pilots stressed, blips on radar suddenly misbehaving, and a simple civilian caught in the crossfire of military precision. But this was no movie. This was her life, and it was slipping into a zone she couldn't control. Her father had been in the Air Force. He had worn wings, stared down at enemy aircraft, trained in the cockpit while the world below carried on oblivious. Piper had grown up watching him, absorbing the rules of the sky like a religion. He had told her once, "The sky doesn't negotiate, Piper. It's beautiful, but it's honest, and it doesn't forgive mistakes." She swallowed hard, fighting a tremor in her hands. Every instrument in the Cessna was steady. Every gauge told the truth. Yet somewhere between antennas and circuits, someone, or something, was seeing her as an interloper, and the consequences of that perception were immediate, sharp, and cold. A sudden gust rocked the plane violently, forcing her to grab the yoke with both hands. She fought the tilt, corrected, but the turbulence seemed to mock her. Sweat ran down her neck, soaking her flight shirt. She could hear her own heartbeat in the headset, a drum of anxiety that matched the warning lights blinking on the tower's consoles she couldn't see. She imagined the officers on the other side of the frequency. Rows of desks, radar screens glowing in the dim light of a room she had never been allowed to enter. Hands hovering over buttons, eyes tracking her tiny aircraft like it carried some terrible secret. She could almost hear the mental calculations, the tension, the silent assumption that she was deliberately climbing into forbidden airspace. Piper whispered a silent plea into the headset, even though she knew it was ridiculous. "I'm not above clearance, I swear." No answer, just the faint static of the radio and the roar of wind through the open skis. Her Cessna dipped slightly, and she corrected, knowing that any sudden movement could look like aggression, could look like she was ignoring the warning. She followed procedures perfectly, voice calm when she responded, fingers precise on the controls, but nothing she did mattered to the blip on the radar. Then the impossible happened. Her transponder reading jumped again on their screen. Numbers that didn't exist in her cockpit, values that she knew were lies, flashed across their monitors. The words above clearance appeared next to her call sign, urgent, accusing. She bit her lip so hard it bled slightly, tasting metal in her mouth. She thought about what could happen next. Fighter jets scrambled in her direction. Heavy fines. An investigation that could ground her permanently. Every scenario she had studied in manuals and safety courses suddenly became terrifyingly real. She was a civilian, unarmed, and utterly exposed in a sky full of military eyes. Her stomach twisted as she banked again, carefully, deliberately trying to create distance. But the radar did not obey her intentions. It saw only what it wanted to see. And in the control tower somewhere, judgment was already being passed. A faint crackle came over the headset and a voice, different from the first, cut through. Cold, precise, professional. Be advised, unidentified behavior remains. Maintain current heading. You are being monitored. Piper's fingers tightened on the yoke until her knuckles were white. Her lungs burned with the effort to stay calm. The desert stretched endlessly below her, mountains jagged against the sky like teeth. The Cessna seemed so small, so fragile. She had to trust herself, trust her instruments, trust her training, but the truth on the radar told a different story. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Every second stretched longer than the last, the plane swinging in gusts, the horizon tilting, the sun painting everything in brutal glare. And then she saw something in the distance, a faint dot moving fast, closing toward her from the direction of the restricted zone. She squinted, heart in her throat. A jet, a chase, or just another phantom of her imagination. Her breath caught. Whatever it was coming. And that's when the voice came again, sharper this time. A mixture of authority and threat that left no room for debate. Identify yourself. Do not deviate. This is your final warning before escalation. Piper Hayes exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. The Cessna trembled beneath her, every vibration amplified by her racing pulse. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't climbing. She hadn't done anything wrong. Yet in the eyes of the radar, the tower, and whoever was watching, she was a threat. The sky had become a courtroom, and she was on trial. The Mojave sun cut harsh lines across the windshield as Piper's fingers hovered over the yoke, tense and unyielding. The Cessna rocked violently in the gusts, but she kept it steady, fighting both the wind and the panic crawling up her spine. The small plane felt fragile, a fragile thread in a sky suddenly ruled by suspicion. Every tick of the altimeter, every twitch of the heading indicator seemed magnified, as if the instruments themselves were conspiring to expose her. The tower's voice broke the tense silence, crisp and cutting. 943, you are above clearance. Repeat. Your altitude exceeds authorized levels. Respond immediately. I'm at 5,500 feet, she said, forcing the words to sound calm, professional. Maintaining altitude. I repeat, 5500. Her own words felt hollow. She trusted the instruments in front of her, but the radar feeding the tower a different reality had made her a phantom of deception. She imagined a room full of uniformed officers, screens glowing, eyes locked on her little dot, calculating, judging. Every second, every flicker on those monitors made the risk feel heavier, more immediate. A pause followed. In that silence, Piper could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the base, rapid and waiting. Then another voice came on the frequency, deeper, colder. Unidentified behavior detected. You are being monitored. Do not deviate. Maintain current heading and altitude. Monitored, the word drilled into her like ice. It implied not just observation, but consequence. Maybe a fighter jet was already tracking her, ready to intercept, ready to enforce rules she hadn't broken. Piper's stomach churned. She had flown hundreds of hours, trained for emergencies, crosswinds, engine failures, but never for this. Never for a sky that accused her of a crime she hadn't committed. The wind hit her left wing with a jolt and the Cessna tilted sharply. Piper corrected, muscles tense, sweat running down her temples. She glanced at the altimeter. 5,500, still steady. And yet, somewhere hundreds of feet above, a radar dot painted her as climbing, as breaking rules. She clenched her teeth. The rules of reality and the rules of the tower no longer matched. She remembered a story her father had told her once. Radar is honest, Piper, but sometimes it's too honest. Ghosts happen, anomalies, things that make the world see what isn't there. But those ghosts can get people killed if no one sees the truth. She swallowed. Maybe that was what was happening now. A ghost on radar accusing her of defiance. But a ghost didn't speak over the radio. A ghost didn't have authority. And in the eyes of the military, the phantom they saw was real enough to act on. Minutes dragged. Piper kept repeating her altitude and heading over the frequency. 5500 level, heading 270, confirmed. The response came, clipped and precise. Confirmed. Do not change heading or altitude. Continue to comply. The phrase sounded almost like a threat. Compliance. There was no negotiation, no room for explanation. Somewhere beyond the thin metal fuselage, beyond the wind and the sun, a chain of command had already begun to form assumptions. She pictured officers packing, marking down times, analyzing blips. She was a problem to solve, not a human being to understand. The wind shifted again, this time stronger, more insistent, slamming into her right wing. Piper countered, struggling to hold her course. Her ears rang with the sound of air rushing past the small cabin, and the headset crackled as another transmission arrived, urgent. Altitude reading shows noncompliance. Confirm your identity. State intentions. You are approaching restricted airspace rapidly. Her throat tightened. She had stated her identity. She had stated her intentions. And yet it was not enough. They didn't hear her words. They saw a threat on the screen. She imagined jets streaking across the sky toward her, missiles armed in training simulations or worse. She could do nothing but hold steady, hands gripping the yoke until her fingers ached. A flash of doubt hit her. What if she did something wrong by mistake? What if her instruments lied? She glanced at the altimeter again. 5,500, heading 270, vertical speed 0. Everything was normal. But for some reason, she had become a suspect in a crime she hadn't committed, in a sky that suddenly had rules beyond human understanding. Another pause on the radio. Her heart hammered in her chest. And then, the words that made her stomach drop. You are being escalated for further monitoring. Military assets are being informed. Maintain current heading. Do not deviate. Escalated. The word echoed in her mind. Military assets, fighter jets, interception. Piper felt her pulse spike. The small Cessna felt even more fragile now, every bolt, every rivet a reminder of her vulnerability. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the instruments, on the flight plan she had filed, on the wind she could see and feel. She could not panic. Panic would make mistakes. Mistakes would give them reason. She corrected the plane again, hands steady despite the trembling in her arms. Every gust of wind was a reminder that she was alive, that the engine still hummed beneath her, that she could still control the plane if the world would let her. Then, without warning, her transponder flickered. Numbers she did not recognize, altitudes she was not flying, appeared to leap across the radar. Her blip surged upward, climbing as if the aircraft had its own mind. She gritted her teeth, trying to understand what was happening. The instruments in front of her told one story, the radar told another. And in the control tower, someone was preparing to act on the latter. Her palms sweated on the yoke. She remembered flight school lessons about system failures, phantom readings, interference. But this was no simulation. This was real, and the stakes were life and career. The wind slammed again, and she fought to hold level, to stay calm. A sudden crackle from the frequency brought her attention back to the human voices behind the monitors. Unidentified altitude anomaly persists. You are now under continuous observation. Further deviation may result in immediate escalation. Escalation. Fighter jets. Military protocol. Piper could feel her stomach lurch as she realized that the minute she had crossed that invisible line in the sky, she had stepped into a world where rules were enforced without negotiation. Her mind raced. She had flown near military zones before, but never this close, never with the radar marking her as something she was. She knew the FAA protocols, the civilian guidelines, the correct responses. But here, those manuals felt inadequate. She was a ghost on someone else's screen, a threat where there was none. Somewhere behind her, the desert stretched endlessly, mountains jagged, sun blazing. The wind battered the plane as if testing her resolve. Piper took another deep breath, repeating the mantra she had learned long ago: control what you can, survive what you can't. She focused on the yoke, the heading, the instruments. She could not control how the tower saw her. She could not control how the radar interpreted her presence. But she could fly the plane, and that was all she had. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe 10. Each second felt magnified, like the weight of the world had landed on the small Cessna. And then she saw it, a shadow in the distance, moving fast, catching up to her from the restricted zone. Her breath caught. Fighter jet, interceptor, or just a training simulation she had accidentally become part of. She swallowed hard. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands shook as she responded to the frequency, 9043, maintaining heading, maintaining altitude, please confirm contact. Silence. And then that same deep, authoritative voice returned, colder than ever. Prepare for possible interception. You are approaching restricted airspace. Do not attempt evasive maneuvers. Piper's heart hammered like a drum in her chest. The wind screamed around her, the sun beat down relentlessly, and somewhere over the vast desert, invisible eyes tracked her every move. She had done nothing wrong, but now, in the eyes of the military, she was a phantom ascending without permission, a civilian poised to become a target. She gritted her teeth and forced calm. The small plane responded to her commands, steady and true. But the weight of unseen eyes, of judgment she hadn't earned, pressed down like a storm cloud. Somewhere ahead, the shadow approached, and she realized the game had changed. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a subject under observation, every move recorded, every decision scrutinized. The sky, once a place of freedom, had become a courtroom. And in that courtroom, her life, her career, and her freedom hung in the balance. The shadow in the distance grew, a sleek silhouette that cut across the desert sky like a predator. Piper Hayes' chest tightened as she realized it wasn't a trick of the light, wasn't turbulence or a mirage. The radar had been right about one thing: someone or something was closing in. But it wasn't a threat she could negotiate with. It was a reminder of how fragile a civilian pilot could become in the eyes of military eyes. She gripped the yoke tighter, knuckles pale, and tried to focus on the instruments. Altitude, 5,500. Vertical speed, 0. Heading, 270. The numbers on her dashboard were steady, unyielding, perfect. The radar in the tower told a different story. Phantom climbs, impossible elevations, a blip that seemed to ignore gravity and logic. She had no control over that, no way to convince anyone watching that the anomaly was a lie. Her voice came over the frequency, calm but firm. 943, maintaining altitude, maintaining heading. Request clarification on radar reading anomaly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the clipped, authoritative tone returned. Affirmative, your flight is being continuously monitored. All readings indicate unusual altitude changes. Do not attempt evasive action. Military response may be initiated if unauthorized maneuvers continue. Piper's stomach lurched. Military response. The words echoed in her mind like a hammer striking metal. Interceptor jets, missiles, protocol. She had never been closer to being mistaken for a target in her life. The wind tossed the Cessna violently, and she countered with practiced skill, but her nerves screamed with every ripple of the metal wings. Her mind raced. She thought back to the flight manuals, to emergency procedures, to the countless drills she had run. There was no procedure for being marked a phantom aggressor in restricted airspace when she had done nothing wrong. Her instruments didn't lie. She hadn't climbed. And yet, here she was, a civilian pilot being treated like a hostile aircraft, hovering in a courtroom made of radar blips and judgment. The shadow ahead moved faster, a jet streaking silently, cutting closer with each passing second. Piper's eyes darted around the horizon, searching for anything, markers, mountains, visual cues that could ground her reality against the false reading on radar. The desert stretched below her, jagged, merciless, a landscape both beautiful and indifferent. She whispered to herself, the mantra her father had drilled into her, control what you can, survive what you can't. Minutes stretched into eternity. Her arms ached from holding the yoke steady, sweat soaked her shirt, and her breathing became a slow, deliberate rhythm to maintain focus. Then, a crackle in the headset broke the monotony, a voice she hadn't heard before, calm but tinged with unease. 943, confirm visual on approaching aircraft. Repeat, confirm visual. Yes, she replied, forcing the word through the dry lump in her throat. Visual confirmed. One aircraft, type unknown, approaching from your bearing, maintaining altitude and heading. Understood, the voice said. Do not deviate, all systems show anomaly persists. Continue compliance. Piper's pulse thundered. Every second was a negotiation she didn't control. The plane's engine hummed steadily beneath her, reliable, obedient, yet entirely unable to convince the radar or the tower that it was innocent. She imagined the officers inside the control room, eyes glued to monitors, hands poised over escalation protocols, calculating the risk, judging her. And then the unthinkable happened. Her transponder flickered again, wildly, sending numbers across the radar that bore no relation to reality. She blinked, trying to comprehend what she was seeing on her own instruments. Nothing. Steady altitude, no climb, no vertical movement. And yet on their screens she was ascending as if defying gravity, a phantom rising beyond all clearance. Panic threatened to claw its way into her chest, but she forced it down, grounding herself in the instruments, in the tactile feel of the yoke, in the small plane that trusted her commands. She couldn't do anything about the radar. She could only fly. A new transmission cut across the frequency, tense, urgent. 943, your altitude readings show persistent noncompliance. Further deviation will result in immediate military action. Repeat, immediate action may be initiated. Her stomach sank. She imagined fighter jets screaming toward her position, weapon systems armed in a drill, and her small Cessna caught in a game designed for machines, not humans. She gritted her teeth and forced calm. Panic could make her make mistakes she couldn't afford. She had to stay calm, stay precise, stay alive. She banked slightly to avoid turbulence from the jet ahead, eyes squinting through the sun glare. The wind slapped against her fuselage like a warning. Every vibration, every snap of metal was amplified in her mind. She was alone up here, accountable to invisible eyes, responsible for proving her innocence to a system that refused to see the truth. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the radar anomaly itself. How could it be possible? Systems occasionally produced ghosts, echoes, errors, but never this consistently. She had been marked as climbing multiple times, rising above clearance, and each time she had maintained perfect control. Every instrument in her cockpit said the same thing, level. But somewhere beyond her vision, someone had decided otherwise. Then a chill ran down her spine. Piper realized the potential consequences, not just fines or suspension, but escalation could mean interception, confrontation, even threat assessment protocols she didn't fully understand. She had crossed an invisible line, and in their eyes, rules demanded enforcement. Her hands ached, her throat was dry, sweat blurred her vision, but she kept her focus, repeating to herself, "Control what you can, survive what you can't." Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The small jet ahead adjusted its position slightly, maintaining a distance she couldn't judge from her seat. The shadow felt less like an aircraft now and more like a symbol, a manifestation of the system's suspicion. Piper gripped the yoke and whispered to herself, fighting the rising tide of fear. And then a sudden new transmission came, calm but with an edge of disbelief. 943, all units report altitude anomaly persists. This is highly irregular. Confirm transponder readings. Report instruments immediately. She swallowed hard. Her transponder was fine. Instruments were fine. Her reality was fine. But somewhere between antennas, satellites, and radar, she had become a phantom aggressor. Her pulse thundered. Sweat ran down her back. She tightened her grip on the yoke, fighting the wind and the fear. The desert stretched endlessly below, sun beating down, landscape indifferent. She whispered again, almost as a prayer, "Please let this end safely. Please." Then a low, vibrating hum reached her ears. She squinted. The approaching jet shifted slightly, then maintained course. Interception was imminent. She couldn't know if it was a drill, a system test, or real enforcement. She could only fly, obey instructions, trust instruments, and pray that reality and perception would somehow align before it was too late. Minutes felt like hours. Every flicker of the Cessna's shadow on the desert below was magnified in her mind. Every blip on the radar, every crackle on the frequency, every word of authority was a countdown. She was caught between two worlds, the sky she knew and the sky the radar demanded she inhabit. Her chest tightened as another transmission came, urgent, clipped. Maintain current heading. Military assets now tracking. All units report anomaly. Do not attempt deviation. You are under observation. Repeat, you are under observation. Panic threatened again, but Piper forced it down. She focused on the instruments, the yoke, the plane that had carried her safely through hundreds of flights. This small aircraft was her ally. The rest, the phantom readings, the military attention, the invisible courtroom, was beyond her control. And in that moment, as the sun dipped slightly behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert, Piper realized something terrifying. The world had decided she was guilty, even though she was innocent. Her life, her career, her freedom, all depended on what would happen next, and on whether the system that had misidentified her could be convinced of the truth before it was too late. The approaching shadow closed ever closer, and she felt the weight of every second pressing down, knowing that the next move could change everything. The runway stretched out below her like a silver ribbon cutting through the desert, deceptively calm compared to the storm raging in her chest. Piper Hayes kept her hands firm on the yoke, muscles aching from tension, eyes darting between instruments and the approaching shadow of the jet still tracking her from a distance. Every second the weight of unseen judgment pressed down, heavier than the hum of the Cessna's engine, heavier than the gusting wind that rattled her wings. She had obeyed every rule, followed every instruction, and yet here she was, a civilian turned suspect by a phantom on radar. The frequency crackled again. 943, maintain current heading. You are approaching restricted airspace. Interception may occur. Repeat, do not deviate. Her chest tightened further. Interception. The word had been floating in the air like a threat, but now it was imminent. She imagined fighter jets streaking from the base, engines screaming, precision-trained pilots ready to enforce rules she hadn't broken. A chill ran down her spine. She had flown hundreds of hours in the sky, but never under this kind of scrutiny, never as a marked threat to a system that didn't recognize innocence. Piper banked the plane slightly, correcting for a gust that threatened to tip her wing. She gritted her teeth and focused on what she could control: instruments, heading, altitude. Everything else was beyond her reach. The transponder, the phantom blip, the military eyes tracking her, they were forces she could not influence. She clenched her jaw. She would survive, she had to. The jet ahead shifted, adjusting its course to mirror hers, still maintaining a cautious distance. Piper's eyes flicked to the altimeter again. 5,500 feet, steady. Nothing had changed. Yet on their radar she continued to climb, a phantom ascending beyond clearance, rising without consent. Every number on their screen was a lie, but a lie with teeth. It could ruin her, could escalate to a level she couldn't even imagine. She whispered to herself, a mantra to cling to reality: control what you can, survive what you can't. Her voice was barely audible over the wind and engine hum, but it anchored her, a tether to the world she knew. The base frequency crackled again, this time with multiple voices. Commands, confirmations, protocol recitations, the coordinated chaos of a system responding to what it perceived as a threat. Piper felt her stomach lurch. Every voice, every command reinforced that they were convinced she was non-compliant, and in their eyes, suspicion demanded enforcement. Maintain heading and altitude, a voice repeated, sterner this time. All units report anomaly persists. Prepare for possible escalation. The words hit her like a punch. Escalation. She envisioned the worst-case scenarios: jets closing in, being forced down, fines, license suspension, public scrutiny, perhaps even accusations of endangering a military installation. Her mind raced through possibilities, calculating actions, contingencies, every response she might need. But the truth remained: she hadn't climbed. She had followed procedure. She had obeyed the rules, and yet she was treated as a criminal. The Cessna pitched against a sudden gust, forcing Piper to correct rapidly. Sweat stung her eyes and her heart hammered. Her muscles ached from the constant tension, but adrenaline carried her through. Every adjustment, every counterbalance was precise, deliberate, a small victory in a sky that seemed determined to see her fail. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the headset and the hum of the engine. And then, unexpectedly, a new voice emerged over the frequency, different from the previous commands. Calm, neutral, almost questioning. 943, we are reviewing your radar signature. Confirm all cockpit instruments are functioning normally. Yes, Piper replied, voice tight but steady. All instruments are normal. Altimeter shows 5,500 feet. Vertical speed 0. Heading 270. There was a pause, longer than any she had endured so far. She could hear her own breathing, the rapid flutter of her pulse in her ears, the constant vibration of the plane against turbulence. And in that silence, she understood the gravity of the situation. Somewhere behind these voices, officers were making decisions that could change her life. Finally, the calm voice returned. Understood. All readings on your instruments are consistent. Further monitoring continues. Do not change heading or altitude. Piper exhaled slowly, forcing herself to relax slightly. It was not over, far from it. But for a fleeting moment, she had been recognized as truthful, as compliant. A small victory, but one that came with no promise of safety. Below, the desert sprawled endlessly, the mountains jagged against the fading sunlight. Piper's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for anything that might give her context, visual confirmation, and anchor to reality. The wind buffeted her again, violent, relentless, and she corrected the plane with precision. Every muscle, every instinct, Every learned response kept her alive, kept her in control of what she could control. The jet ahead remained, moving in tandem, a silent observer of her every maneuver. Piper realized she was trapped between two realities, the one she inhabited, governed by her instruments and her training, and the one projected onto the radar screens, governed by unknown algorithms and human assumptions. One was real, one was dangerous, one could destroy her career, even her life. The frequency crackled again. 943 radar anomaly persists. We are initiating a protocol review. Maintain heading and altitude. Interception remains possible. Panic clawed at her chest. Interception remained possible. Every second the shadow ahead, the phantom on the radar, the wind, the sun, the pressure, it all combined into a suffocating weight. She fought to stay calm, to stay precise, to stay alive. Her mind ran through every possible maneuver, every contingency, every possible outcome, and none of them offered comfort. Then unexpectedly a technician's voice broke through, low, almost hesitant. "Wait, this isn't normal. The anomaly, it's consistent with system simulation errors. Could be training mode interference." Piper blinked, stunned. Could it be true? Was all this, the escalation, the shadowing, the phantom climbs, a glitch? Her pulse spiked with a mix of hope and disbelief. If so, she might survive this ordeal without confrontation. But if it wasn't, if it was real, she was still in the crosshairs of a system designed to react instantly, with no consideration for innocence. She kept her hands firm on the yoke, forcing calm. The jet ahead shifted slightly, maintaining position, a silent guardian or a silent threat, she couldn't tell which. Her eyes flicked to the instruments again. Steady, precise, perfect. Below, the desert glimmered in the evening light, vast, indifferent. Piper realized something she had always known but never felt so keenly. The sky was beautiful, but it was honest, and it didn't forgive mistakes, real or imagined. The frequency crackled again and the calm voice returned. 943, continue monitoring. Verification of radar systems is underway. Do not deviate. Military assets remain on standby. Piper exhaled slowly, a shudder running through her body. She had obeyed. She had controlled what she could. She had survived the wind, the turbulence, the fear. But the shadow of escalation still loomed, the phantom blip still marked her, and the consequences of being misunderstood were far from over. Minutes stretched again, the sun dipping lower behind the mountains, painting the desert gold and crimson. Piper realized the truth. She was caught in a test she hadn't asked for, judged by a system she couldn't influence, and yet every decision she made mattered. Every small correction of the yoke, every steady breath, every calm word over the frequency could tip the balance between survival and disaster. Her pulse slowed slightly as she settled into focus, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. The shadow ahead, the phantom on radar, the unseen eyes, all remained. And somewhere in the tower, somewhere behind the monitors, someone had to discover the truth before it was too late. Because the moment the system, or the people controlling it, decided she was guilty, there would be no turning back. And Piper Hayes, a civilian pilot with a flawless record, understood that the sky she had loved her whole life could, in a single misreading, become a battlefield she had never imagined. The runway lights of the base glimmered like distant stars, promising stability yet carrying a weight of judgment Piper had never felt before. Every mile closer sent her heart hammering, every gust of wind a reminder of how small, how exposed she was. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and forced the Cessna to respond with precision. Each instrument was steady, each system functioning perfectly, but somewhere in the towers and screens ahead, the numbers told a story she hadn't lived. She taxied closer to the designated parking area, a wide apron far from the terminal, where trucks and personnel idled as though waiting for a criminal to arrive. Piper's fingers trembled slightly as she cut the engine, the roar dying to a tense silence. The weight of anticipation pressed down on her chest, heavier than any turbulence she had encountered. Remain seated, keep hands visible, a voice commanded through the open window of a waiting truck. Uniformed officers approached, serious and precise as if expecting hostility. Piper kept her hands on the yoke, her seatbelt tight, every breath measured. She was compliant, calm, careful, but she knew compliance was just a first step. It might not be enough. The first officer stepped close, his eyes scanning the small cockpit, his expression unreadable. "Why did you climb after being ordered out?" His words were clipped, a professional accusation disguised as a question. Piper shook her head, swallowing a lump of fear. "I didn't climb. My instruments, everything in my cockpit was steady. Altitude, heading, vertical speed, nothing changed." The officer's lips pressed thin. He gestured for her to exit. Hands visible, feet steady, she stepped onto the hot tarmac, feeling the heat rise through her shoes. Cameras clicked somewhere nearby. Every uniformed figure watching, every camera pointed, turned her private struggle into a public judgment. "Step back, 943, another officer commanded. Piper complied, her mind racing. She tried to remember every FAA regulation, every procedural drill she had learned. She had done everything by the book, yet the world treated her as though she had intentionally provoked military enforcement. They began questioning her, formally now, recording every word, every gesture. "Explain the readings on your transponder," one officer demanded. "Your altitude reports on our systems indicate persistent noncompliance. How do you explain this?" Piper repeated herself, voice firm despite the tremor she felt inside. "I have no explanation. My instruments recorded exactly what I just reported. Altitude 5,500 feet, heading 270, vertical speed 0. I followed every order from the tower. I didn't climb." The officers conferred among themselves, eyes narrowing, gestures sharp, voices low but tense. She could feel the weight of their skepticism pressing down. Somewhere in that room, someone must have doubted her words, seen only the radar blip, the phantom numbers, and assumed guilt. Hours seemed to pass. Piper's throat ached from repeated statements, her legs stiff from sitting on the tarmac under the desert sun, the small shadows of mountains stretching long and oppressive across the apron. She thought of her father, retired Air Force, and his insistence on integrity. "Always report truthfully, even when the world doubts you," he had said. She clung to that, repeating every word in her mind as evidence of her resolve. Then one of the officers muttered something that made her pause. "It's not her, it's the system. The anomaly, look at these logs." Piper's eyes widened. The words were tentative, almost fearful. Could it be possible? The entire escalation, the military tracking, the phantom climbs, the warnings over the radio, could it really be a mistake? She held her breath as the officer continued, pointing to printed radar logs and computer screenshots. "It looks like a simulation overlay was active. System testing. Phantom altitude anomalies generated for training exercises. She's never actually climbed. Everything she reported checks out." Relief surged through her chest, quickly tempered by disbelief. She had been accused, monitored, perhaps almost intercepted, for no reason at all. Her pulse slowed slightly, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins, a stark reminder of how close the misinterpretation had brought her to catastrophe. Another officer stepped forward, expression apologetic yet tense. We need to verify everything before releasing you. This is serious. You were treated as a potential threat to restricted airspace. By the rules, we had to act." Piper nodded, swallowing hard. She felt a mixture of relief and lingering anger, a complex tangle of emotions that left her shaking despite the heat. Relief that she was not guilty. Anger at being accused. Pride that she had maintained composure throughout. And fear at how fragile her safety had been, hanging on system errors she could neither predict nor prevent. The formalities dragged on. Every question felt like a test, every pause like a judgment. Piper answered clearly, precisely, with the honesty she had clung to all her life. The officers documented everything, fingers tapping keyboards, eyes scanning screens, a quiet hum of bureaucracy masking the human tension beneath. Hours later, they finally moved her to a quieter room, the heat of the desert tarmac replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. She sank into a chair, rubbing her temples, trying to process what had happened. Phantom blips, misreadings, military escalation. And yet she had survived. One officer, younger with a tentative expression, leaned forward. "We've confirmed it. You weren't above clearance. Everything in your cockpit was correct. The anomaly was system-generated. You followed protocol perfectly. I'm sorry for the stress this caused you." Piper's chest heaved with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. I did what I was trained to do. I didn't want to break the rules. I didn't want to be a problem." The officer nodded, understanding her tension. "You weren't a problem. You were unlucky and precise. You handled it better than most could have. That's important." Relief washed over her, but the emotional tension remained. She had been nearly treated as a threat, all because of a phantom on a screen. The sky she loved, the freedom she cherished, had almost been turned against her. The sense of vulnerability lingered. Her mind replayed the entire flight, every gust of wind, every instruction over the radio, every heartbeat in that isolated cockpit. She had navigated not just turbulence, but human fear, mechanical error, and the invisible weight of authority. Every moment had demanded precision, courage, and unwavering focus. Eventually, they allowed her to leave the room, escorting her back to the plane. The jet that had shadowed her earlier had long departed, leaving only the silent expanse of the desert. Piper climbed back into the cockpit, fingers brushing the yoke, eyes scanning the horizon. Everything was calm now, deceptively calm. The wind, the sun, the mountains, everything as it had been. Yet she felt changed, as if the sky itself had marked her, tested her, and released her. As she prepared to taxi away, another officer handed her a document. "We'd like you to provide a full report for training purposes. Your experience could help prevent this from happening to others." Piper took the paper, staring at it. Relief, exhaustion, and a strange sense of vindication mixed in her chest. She had survived, obeyed, and emerged with the truth intact. Yet the knowledge that she had been almost treated as a threat lingered like a shadow over her. She climbed back into the Cessna, started the engine, and felt the familiar vibration beneath her seat, the hum of propeller cutting through the air. She taxied carefully, hands firm on the controls, heart still racing. The desert stretched ahead, vast and open, a place of freedom she had almost lost. And as she lifted off, heading back into open skies, Piper Hayes knew one undeniable truth. The world above was not always fair. The radar, the rules, the human judgment, none guaranteed safety or understanding. She had survived not because the system had recognized her, but because she had trusted herself, her training, and her instruments. Yet even as the wind buffeted her wings, even as the mountains slipped past below, she couldn't shake the feeling that the experience was far from over. Somewhere, the logs, the screens, the officers' memories, everything she had endured, would become part of a lesson she hadn't asked for, a story she hadn't intended to tell. And Piper Hayes, flying back into the freedom she had almost lost, realized that the sky she loved could be both sanctuary and tribunal. She had survived, but she would never forget. The investigation room smelled of stale coffee and the faint tang of electronics, a sterile mixture that seemed to amplify every heartbeat. Piper Hayes sat stiffly in a chair too large for her, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been cleared of wrongdoing, but the ordeal was far from over. Behind the locked doors of the base, every officer, technician, and analyst she had seen that day was replaying her flight, combing logs, scrutinizing radar sweeps, and trying to understand how a small civilian aircraft had appeared to ascend beyond clearance when, in reality, it had not moved an inch vertically. She glanced around at the monitors displaying endless lines of data, altitude readings, transponder signals, military tracking logs, timestamps, each detail a testament to the scrutiny she had endured. She knew the technology could lie, could misrepresent, could exaggerate, but she hadn't expected it to wield such power over human judgment. Every display felt like a silent accusation, a reminder of how easily perception could trump truth. A young technician entered, pale and slightly hesitant, carrying a tablet covered in annotations and charts. He avoided direct eye contact with Piper, but his fingers trembled slightly as he set the device down on the table. Piper, I think I may have found something unusual," he said, voice quiet but steady. "It's not what anyone expected." She leaned forward instinctively, heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" He tapped the screen, bringing up a series of radar logs from her flight. Colored blips, altitude lines, timestamps flashing in rapid succession. This anomaly, it's consistent with a training simulation overlay that was mistakenly left active on the radar system. Basically, the system was running a phantom altitude test while you were flying near the restricted airspace. It created false readings, showing your aircraft climbing when it was. Piper stared at the screen, disbelief mixing with cautious relief. So, all of it, the escalation, the warnings, the shadow jet, it wasn't real. "Not exactly," the technician said, biting his lip. "Some parts were real, the monitoring, the communications, but the phantom climbs were a glitch. The system flagged you because it was testing procedures on aircraft that weren't even there. You were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Her shoulders sagged slightly and she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Relief and anger collided in her chest. Relief that she hadn't been a threat. Anger at the invisible system that had almost made her one. She thought of the cockpit, the wind, the sun, the shadowing jet. All of it had been terrifyingly real, and all of it had been a simulation error. The technician hesitated, then added, "It's a rare mistake. I mean, almost never happens, and no one noticed it until we started comparing flight logs and cross-referencing your instruments. Honestly, if you'd panicked or done something unexpected, it could have escalated further." Panic? Piper's pulse spiked again as the memory of the radio warnings and phantom blips resurfaced. She had obeyed every instruction, maintained altitude, followed the procedures drilled into her for years. But she had been at the mercy of a system she couldn't see, couldn't control, and hadn't even known was active. She began, then stopped. Her throat was tight, dry from the tension that had never truly left her body. "So, everything that happened, it wasn't me, it was the system." "Exactly," he said, nodding. "And you handled it perfectly. You didn't panic. You followed the rules. That's why you're sitting here calm instead of, well, you know." The thought of what "well" could have been made her shiver. Escalation protocols, interception, accusations, all hanging over her like an invisible noose. She had survived, yes, but barely. And for what? A phantom created by an error no one had noticed. Another officer stepped into the room, older, authoritative, clipboard in hand. He glanced at Piper, then at the technician. "Is this confirmed?" he asked, voice steady but carrying the weight of responsibility. "Yes, sir," the technician said. "All logs match the simulation overlay. The system created the phantom readings. Piper Hayes did not climb. Her instruments are consistent with a normal flight." The officer nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as he processed the revelation. Then it settled. This was a system error, not pilot error. She followed protocol, understood. "Yes, sir," the technician replied, relief flooding his voice. Piper felt her shoulders loosen slightly, but she didn't exhale fully. The relief was tempered by exhaustion and lingering tension. She had been judged, almost punished, nearly treated as a threat, and all because of an invisible error. She had survived thanks to calm, training, and instinct, not because the system had recognized her truth. The officer turned to Piper directly. "You've done well. I know this was stressful, but your composure under pressure, following instructions, maintaining altitude, reporting correctly, was exemplary. You should be proud." Piper nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Pride felt strange, mingled with anger and disbelief. She had survived an ordeal most civilians couldn't imagine, yet it had been unnecessary, a trial without reason, orchestrated by a system that didn't account for human judgment or the nuance of reality. Hours passed as the investigation wound down. Piper was allowed to review logs, transponder readings, and radar captures herself. Every entry, every timestamp, every anomaly told the same story. She had done everything correctly. She hadn't climbed. She hadn't deviated. The system, designed to protect and train, had misrepresented her actions to those who could escalate enforcement instantly. The technician lingered, watching her carefully. I know this doesn't undo the stress," he said softly, "but I hope it helps to know the truth." Piper nodded, grateful but still tense. Truth was one thing, survival another. She had been lucky, skillful, yes, but also lucky. Any minor deviation, any lapse in composure, any failure to follow protocol, and the outcome could have been catastrophic. Finally, they allowed her to leave the investigation room, escorting her back to the aircraft. The Cessna sat under the desert sky, the shadow of mountains long and sharp in the fading light. Piper climbed into the cockpit, hands brushing the yoke, engine purring beneath her like a loyal companion. She felt every vibration, every hum, every subtle shift in the wind, a reminder that control and survival were inseparable in the air. As she started the engine, one officer approached, holding a small stack of papers. "We'd like a full report," he said. "Your experience will be used for training, to prevent this from happening again." Piper nodded, taking the documents. The idea of reliving the ordeal, of translating panic into lesson plans, was both exhausting and strangely empowering. She had survived chaos created by human error, technology, and circumstance, and now her story could help others navigate similar situations. She taxied toward the runway, the Cessna steady beneath her. The wind had softened, the sun dipping behind mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. And yet, the memory of the phantom blips, the shadowing jet, the warnings over the radio, all of it, remained vivid, a reminder of how close she had come to disaster. The young technician waved from the side, a faint smile on his face. "Thanks for handling it the right way," he said. "You probably saved yourself and the system from a bigger problem." Piper gave a faint smile, fingers tightening briefly on the yoke. "I just did what I had to do," she said quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." She lined up on the runway, took a deep breath, and lifted off into the open sky. The desert stretched endlessly beneath her, vast and indifferent, yet she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The sky was both sanctuary and tribunal, beauty and danger intertwined. And as she climbed into the fading light, Piper Hayes understood one immutable truth. Even when systems fail, even when judgment is flawed, survival depends on skill, composure, and courage. Above the desert, she finally exhaled, though her mind remained alert. Somewhere in the logs, the radar, and the systems she had unknowingly challenged, lessons would be learned. And she would be part of that story, a reminder that even the smallest pilot can hold their ground against forces beyond comprehension. The sky was calm again, but Piper knew better than to trust appearances. Danger, misinterpretation, and system errors could strike without warning, and she had seen firsthand how quickly the line between safety and catastrophe could blur. The following morning, Piper returned to the base under the glow of dawn, the desert stretching endlessly, a canvas of gold and violet. The calm of sunrise contrasted sharply with the storm of questions, fear, and adrenaline she had experienced the day before. She felt a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity. The investigation wasn't over, and neither was her story. The main operations center was a hive of activity. Officers, technicians, and analysts moved with precise urgency, eyes scanning screens, fingers flying across keyboards. Piper's presence drew a few curious glances. Her ordeal had made waves throughout the base. Whispers followed her as she walked past rows of monitors, each displaying data she could barely comprehend. An older officer met her at the door, a stern but not unkind expression. "Piper Hayes, please come this way. We need your input on the report." She followed, stepping cautiously into a room filled with screens displaying her flight, logs, and radar anomalies. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, but one thing was clear. The phantom climb had affected multiple systems, multiple personnel, and could have triggered catastrophic responses if not for her composure. A young analyst spoke up, pointing to a cluster of logs. "Look at this, sir." The simulation overlay was still active from last night's training exercise. It wasn't isolated. It affected 3 other flights in the vicinity, but they were aware and on standby. "Piper, you were the only civilian in the area, so the system flagged you automatically." Piper's chest tightened. 3 other flights. She had been alone in the sky, yet in the eyes of the system she had become a target, a phantom threat. She thought of the jet shadowing her, the repeated warnings over the radio, the endless seconds of terror in a small cockpit above a vast desert. Her pulse quickened again, the memory sharp and immediate. The older officer nodded solemnly. "We're reviewing protocol now. There's no excuse for leaving a simulation active in such a sensitive airspace. Your quick thinking and adherence to procedure likely prevented escalation." "Thank you," Piper said, voice tight. "But what if I hadn't reacted perfectly? What if someone else had been flying that day?" The analyst exchanged a glance with the officer. "That's precisely the concern. You were the variable that the system couldn't account for. Had you deviated even slightly or panicked, we could have had a serious incident. This is why we're documenting everything: your actions, the system's failure, and the need for improved safeguards." Piper nodded, a sense of unease lingering. She had survived, but she couldn't shake the image of the phantom blip, the shadowing jet, and the knowledge that the system could so easily misinterpret reality. The sky, she realized, was not only a sanctuary but a court of judgment, where perception often outweighed truth. Hours passed as she reviewed logs, gave her account, and explained her decision-making process during the flight. Every detail was scrutinized, every decision dissected. Piper's calm demeanor, clear recollection, and adherence to protocol were noted repeatedly. Analysts nodded, officers scribbled notes, and yet she couldn't help but feel the lingering tension, the unspoken acknowledgement of how close she had come to disaster. Finally, the older officer spoke again, this time with a hint of relief in his tone. "We're preparing a full report to submit to command. The system error is confirmed, and your actions will be cited as exemplary. You've turned what could have been a catastrophe into a learning opportunity for everyone involved." Piper exhaled, a mix of relief and lingering tension. She wanted to smile, but the memory of fear and near judgment lingered too vividly. Survival had required perfect calm under impossible pressure, and the reality of how fragile that balance had been was hard to shake. The analyst spoke again, a hint of excitement in his voice. "We've also traced the phantom blip to a misconfiguration in the radar simulation overlay. Normally, it's isolated, but a system update last week introduced a glitch. This oversight almost created a crisis scenario. Piper, you were literally flying through an error in the system, one that no one anticipated." Her eyes widened. Literally flying through an error. That explained the shadowing jet, the repeated warnings, the persistent monitoring. Everything she had experienced, real, terrifying, and almost fatal, had been a system's phantom. The older officer nodded. "It's unprecedented. Your case will likely become a reference point in training and protocol development. You handled the situation exactly as required, despite the unexpected circumstances. We owe you thanks and a serious debrief on how to prevent similar incidents in the future." Piper nodded, her mind spinning. She felt relief, pride, and lingering adrenaline coursing through her. The ordeal had tested every skill, every nerve, every lesson she had learned in flight school, and she had passed, not because anyone had believed her initially, but because she had trusted herself, her instruments, and her training. As she stepped out of the operations center, the desert sky greeted her once again, vast, golden, and indifferent. She climbed into her Cessna, engine humming like a loyal companion beneath her. The lessons were clear. Systems could fail, human judgment could be flawed, and perception often outweighed reality, but she had survived. The wind buffeted the small plane as she lifted off, propeller slicing through the early morning air. She felt the familiar surge of freedom, the exhilaration of control, tempered by the knowledge of how close she had come to being misunderstood. The desert stretched below her, the mountains sharp against the sky, a reminder that the world was vast and full of unseen forces. And yet, as she climbed higher, Piper realized the importance of her ordeal, not just for herself, but for everyone who might find themselves caught in the intersection of human judgment and technology. She had been tested, judged, and nearly condemned by systems she could not see, yet she had emerged intact because she trusted herself. The young technician waved from below, a faint smile on his face. "Thanks, Piper," he called. "You probably saved more than just yourself. You gave us a lesson in the limits of technology." Piper gave a small, tired smile, her hands steady on the yoke. "Just did what I had to do," she replied. "Hope it helps someone else next time." The desert fell away beneath her, replaced by open sky. Piper Hayes felt a sense of calm, but also a lingering edge of tension, an acknowledgement that the sky could be beautiful, indifferent, and unforgiving all at once. She had survived the phantom blip, the shadowing jet, the warnings, and the judgment. But she would never forget the fear, the uncertainty, or the realization of how fragile safety could be. And somewhere in the system's logs, in the reports being written, and in the minds of officers and analysts, her story would remain, a testament to skill, calm, and courage in the face of a crisis that existed only on a screen. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the desert, and Piper climbed higher and higher, the wind a companion and reminder that the sky was hers, yet never truly safe. She exhaled, taking in the vastness, the freedom, and the lingering tension. The ordeal was almost over, but its lessons would stay with her forever. The morning air was crisp as Piper Hayes taxied her Cessna out onto the runway, the desert stretching endlessly around her, sun rising in streaks of gold and crimson. The ordeal of the past 24 hours, the phantom radar blips, the shadowing jet, the warnings, the interrogation, had left its mark, etched deep into her chest. Every nerve in her body remained alert, every muscle taut from tension, but the calm in her instruments mirrored the calm she was striving to regain within herself. The base commander approached, flanked by officers and the young technician who had first traced the system error. Their expressions were serious but tinged with respect. Piper felt a mix of apprehension and pride. She had survived the system's phantom judgment, but the human consequences, the recognition, the documentation, the scrutiny, were about to be delivered. "Piper Hayes," the commander began, voice steady, deliberate, "your actions during yesterday's incident were exemplary. You followed protocol perfectly, maintained composure under extreme pressure, and acted in accordance with every FAA and military guideline. Your case has become a benchmark for evaluating civilian interactions with military airspace. You've set a standard for training and protocol reviews going forward." Piper exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his words. Relief, pride, exhaustion, all collided in a wave that left her shaking slightly. She had flown hundreds of hours before, faced turbulence, engine failures, and harsh weather, but none of it had tested her the way yesterday had. The sky, the system, and human judgment had aligned in a perfect storm of danger and misunderstanding, and she had survived. The young technician stepped forward, eyes bright. "We've also finalized the investigation report. The system error has been corrected, protocols updated, and your actions documented. Your experience will train pilots and personnel to respond correctly should a similar anomaly occur in the future. You've literally changed how this system operates." Piper's lips pressed together, a mix of disbelief and pride rising in her chest. "I just did what I had to do," she said quietly. "I followed what I knew. I didn't expect all this." "None of us did," the commander admitted. "But what matters is that you stayed calm, precise, and professional. That's what kept everyone safe, including you. This could have ended very differently if you had panicked or reacted impulsively." Her mind flashed back to the wind tossing the Cessna, the shadow of the jet streaking silently nearby, the crackling voice over the radio insisting she was above clearance. She swallowed, the memory still sharp, still capable of spiking her adrenaline despite the calm of morning. The officers handed her a formal citation, recognition for her composure and professionalism. Piper held it carefully, a tangible acknowledgement of a day that had tested her in every way possible. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned it over in her palms, realizing the magnitude of what had transpired. A civilian pilot, misidentified by a system, nearly caught in a human-machine judgment trap, and emerging not just unscathed, but as a symbol of skill, calm, and courage. "Thank you," she said finally, voice steadier now, though still tinged with emotion. I appreciate this. It was intense." The commander nodded, understanding. "Intense doesn't begin to describe it, but your actions have ensured that what happened yesterday becomes a lesson, not a catastrophe. That's rare, and that's commendable." Piper climbed into the cockpit once again, engine humming beneath her, the familiar vibration grounding her. The young technician waved from below, a small smile of reassurance. She returned it, taking a deep breath and letting her hands rest lightly on the yoke. The desert lay wide and golden below, mountains sharp against the horizon, the early morning sun painting everything in vivid color. As she taxied onto the runway, her thoughts drifted to the fragility of the sky, the systems designed to protect, and the human fallibility that could escalate errors to near disaster. She had flown through all of it, fear, misjudgment, miscommunication, and had emerged intact because of calm, training, and instinct. That realization, sharp and profound, anchored her as she prepared for takeoff. The Cessna lifted smoothly into the sky, wings slicing through the warm morning air. The desert spread below her, a vast and indifferent landscape, yet a place where she had proven her skill and composure. The wind buffeted the plane gently now, a reminder that the sky was beautiful, but also unyielding, indifferent, and sometimes dangerous. As she climbed higher, Piper's mind replayed the key moments: the phantom blip, the shadowing jet, the repeated warnings, the interrogation, the investigation. Each moment had tested her in ways no simulation could replicate. Each decision she had made, each breath she had controlled, had kept her alive. Somewhere far below in the operations center, analysts and officers were reviewing the logs, finalizing the reports and updating protocols. Piper had become part of a legacy she hadn't asked for, a civilian pilot whose calm and precision had prevented a false alarm from becoming a real disaster. She realized, with a mix of pride and solemnity, that the sky could test anyone at any moment. Preparation, composure, and clarity of thought were the only defenses. She banked slightly, letting the Cessna glide over the rugged desert landscape. The sun rose higher, illuminating the valleys and cliffs in stark relief. Piper felt a quiet exhilaration. She was free, yet profoundly changed. She had experienced the tension of near catastrophe, the fear of being misunderstood, and the relief of surviving not because the system had judged correctly, but because she had trusted herself. A distant hum caught her attention. She squinted, noticing a small aircraft in the distance, a commercial plane, routine, ordinary. And yet she remembered the phantom blip, the shadowing jet, and the invisible eyes watching her every move. A shiver ran down her spine. She had survived, yes, but the memory of being misjudged lingered, a quiet, persistent reminder of the fragile line between safety and danger. Her radio crackled softly, a standard frequency for civilian traffic. "Good morning, 943. Clearance confirmed. Enjoy your flight." Piper smiled faintly, fingers tightening briefly on the yoke. The world had recognized her truth, at least for now, but she knew better than to take it for granted. The sky was vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. Mistakes, whether human or mechanical, could happen at any moment, and she had been reminded how close she could come to disaster, even when flying perfectly. As she soared higher, the desert and mountains fatting below, Piper Hayes felt a deep sense of resolve. She had survived an ordeal that could have destroyed her career, reputation, or life. She had emerged stronger, sharper, and more aware of the delicate balance between human skill and technological oversight. And though the morning was calm, though the sun shone warmly over the desert, she knew the sky would always carry its tests, its dangers, and its hidden challenges. But she had proven something vital, that even in the face of misjudgment, error, and the unknown, skill, composure, and courage could prevail. The wind buffeted her wings gently as she leveled out, heading toward the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly beneath her, golden and beautiful, indifferent yet breathtaking. Piper exhaled fully for the first time in hours, savoring the calm, but also carrying with her the memory of the tension, the fear, and the triumph that had defined the past day. Above the vast landscape, Piper Hayes, civilian pilot, phantom target, survivor of system error, flew with clarity, resolve, and a quiet acknowledgement that the sky was hers, but that it would always demand respect. She had faced the invisible tribunal, navigated the misreadings, and come through stronger. And as she disappeared into the endless sky, golden sunlight glinting off her wings, one truth lingered. The line between safety and danger was razor-thin. Perception could deceive, and yet human skill, courage, calm, and precision could carve a path through even the most uncertain skies. For Piper Hayes, the flight was over, but the lessons, the tension, and the triumph would remain forever etched in the sky she loved.